Welcome to Masterpiece Online and to our talks program. This afternoon's panel discussion is particularly relevant, I think, to today's world, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion broadly, deeply, passionately, living with collections. I have the great pleasure, to chair the Masterpiece Fair, and I'm delighted to see so many of you from all over the world who have been joining us for this afternoon's discussion. Masterpiece, with its ethos of cross-collecting, the careful mixing of works of art from all periods and regions of the globe as a cohesive whole, owes its success to the passion, connoisseurship, and scholarship of our exhibitors. In the absence of our physical fair this year, we are relishing the opportunity to showcase this knowledge to our existing and new audiences through our online talks programs, videos by our exhibitors hosted on our website, and short Instagram TV movies. Discovering about works of art through the voice of a passionate exhibitor is one of the most engaging ways to foster appreciation and knowledge. I would strongly recommend that you visit our Masterpiece website and our Masterpiece microsite on the selling platform Artsy, which I hope you'll find reflects the character of our physical fair. The website is a wonderful and exciting way to explore the fair, and I think you will find still allows the serendipity and opportunity to discover perhaps unfamiliar works of art that is such a hallmark of Masterpiece. Masterpiece is dedicated to supporting our cultural partners who are facing great challenges due to forced closures of public galleries and museums. This year, we are offering unlimited free access to all artworks, conversations, and content during Masterpiece Online at masterpiecefair.com. In return, we ask that you consider donating to the Masterpiece Cultural Fund to support museums in the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and in Asia, and a link to donate is included in the chat box. I'm particularly delighted to welcome our moderator this afternoon. Mitchell Owens is the Decorative Arts Editor of Architectural Digest, and has also extensively written for publications including the New York Times and the World of Interiors. His encyclopedic knowledge is legendary and visible to all on AD's podcast, the AD Aesthete. Mitch, if I may, I'm now going to hand over you to introduce the panelists and to get the proceedings underway.
Philip, thank you very much. And in addition to thanking you, a dear old friend and someone from whom I've learned an enormous amount over the years, I'd like to thank very much Masterpiece London, its entire staff, for being able to show the world in a challenging time that an august organization such as Masterpiece London can turn itself around on a dime and become an amazingly modern, forward-thinking venue for ideas, beauty, thought, and collecting. And I would very much like to welcome our guests today. Panelist Justin McGuirk, the Chief Curator at the Design Museum in London. Rose Heyman, founder of Rose Uniacke, the British interior designer, furniture and product designer, and a specialist in antiques. And also Boris Vervoordt, the director of the Axel Vervoordt company, all of whom are talents from whom I've learned an enormous amount over the years. I continue to learn, and I look forward to seeing you even virtually. It's just like being at home. I think one of the really interesting aspects of collecting is it is an activity that's open to absolutely everyone. That one can collect broadly, passionately, and deeply, but one has to know what to do with those things one has then collected. So what we're having today, I believe, is a conversation about conversations, because objects need to talk to each other for them to be effectively lived with, for them to be effectively appreciated. And I know one of the things I wanted Justin to be able to discuss is slide number 6. Is that one of the things that I think makes that particular room so extraordinarily lovely, and that one can take away as a collector, a connoisseur, or as a beginning kind of like collector or connoisseur, is the fact that there are different shapes, different sizes, different silhouettes. And I think it's an incredibly beautiful room, even if modernism is not necessarily one's favorite style. It still tells you so much visually.
Well, thank you, Mitch. There's a reason why I wanted to talk about this room. And it's not because I'm a collector, which I'm not. In fact, the Design Museum is not one of the bigger collecting institutions as museums go in the UK. We're not the nation's storehouse for design, and we collect very carefully and specifically, but not at length. So I wanted to talk about this because one of the key designers of it, Charlotte Perriand, is the subject of an exhibition that we're doing next year in 2021. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is because my approach to this conversation today is really less about collecting perhaps and more about what you termed objects living together. And it's the idea of the interior as an autonomous vision, the idea of an interior that can be of its age and speak to a future. And I think it has been a long time, in fact, since interiors have tried to look forward, to look to a different future. And I think there are various reasons for that. You know, I think we are slightly apprehensive about the future. And in fact, the contemporary interior looks back more to the 1950s, I would say today, than it does to any kind of intrinsically contemporary moment or to something future looking. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at a few rooms by a designer who in her 20s was very much embodying the spirit of her age, in fact, in a rather futuristic way. So what we're looking at is a living room, or in fact, it's a mini flat, but you can only see the living room, which was recreated, or rather, it was staged for the Salon d'Automne in Paris in 1929. And it's the work of Le Corbusier and his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, but the furniture was really in the hands of Charlotte Perriand, who didn't get credit for that until much later. And what we're looking at is a vision of the modern interior enacted in metal, bent metal, tubes, sheet metal, chromed metal, and leather. And it was a rather a futuristic, a bold vision of the time. And I mean, it's not that I want to talk about specific pieces, although you've got a revolving chair there, which is much more based on a kind of office chair, and you've got this classic, and if you look in the middle distance, that recliner, which was so modern for its time and spoke of both leisure and the future and the machine age. It's more the idea that an interior can entirely embody its moment. And I feel that probably what we're going to talk about today is how objects from different eras can coexist, which is very much the ethos of you know, interior design today and probably collecting today. But I'm quite interested in the more visionary aspect of the interior, where an interior is a singular vision that is entirely contemporary. And one rarely sees that now. And I think one of the reasons is because we don't do our thinking, we don't really think about the future through furnitures and interiors anymore. We go to other disciplines for that. We look at technology, or we look at digital devices, or what have you. But you know, the idea that we express our moment through furniture is in a way a weirdly outdated idea.
But it's really fascinating that you say that, because I look at so many interiors. Let's say you mentioned the 1950s. Could we see slide 2, which to me is one of those rooms that, although it's done in the 1950s, is what was called the big room at Chateau Mouton Rothschild, decorated in the late 1950s by Philippe de Rothschild and his wife Pauline, in which you find very modern, very contemporary works of art by Graves and César and Lippold, along with 17th and 18th century furniture. But yet the feeling is very forward thinking. it is in its way, and you can correct me, and I hope you will, if I'm not right. It is in its way runs on a parallel track to that Charlotte Perrien room that we were just looking at.
Well, it's interesting that, I mean, it's interesting that this is a 1950s interior looking back to kind of Louis XVI, you know, furniture. And it just goes to show that even then, this idea that you combine the historic with the contemporary was contemporary. But in a way, what I'm trying to allude to is this idea that there was a time when designers and architects and interior designers thought very hard about how one might live differently. And I don't see that happening in the world today. And I think when we think about the way the property market is changing, for instance, one thinks about smart home technology, one thinks about the kind of micro home phenomenon, but I'm taking this on a different trajectory away from collecting, and I don't mean to. I just think it's interesting to look back. And now, of course, because those items were visionary, they're some of the most, you know, I mean, some of the most collectible, expensive collector's items you can hope to buy.
And they're now practically antiques.
Well, they're 100 years old. Yeah, they're
exactly. I mean, Rose, I mean, what is your opinion? I mean, I think of you and Boris in particular, both of you, creating rooms that speak of today and that are very attuned to today, but which also have a great appreciation for bringing the past into the present, various styles, various materials, in much the same way that one sees at Masterpiece, when one goes from booth to booth and sees the mixture of the old and the new and the futuristic and the Baroque.
I don't think I know whether what I do represents today. It's just what I do, I guess. It's hard to think about it in those terms. And I've always, all the way through my career, I've used furniture from different times, different periods, existing things usually. Although I do make furniture now, and I do include that, and I include contemporary furniture too from other people if it feels right. And I'm interested in the sustainable aspect of reuse of furniture. I've never considered, although I would like the idea of it doing a completely contemporary new. I rather think that actually what is new about what we're all doing now is we're building interiors around a different aspect of the house. We all live in completely different ways. We don't have heaps of staff behind green baize doors. We live in our kitchens, we cook, we do things together more. And I think I try to build interiors that reflect the architecture they are within and also the practical life that they need to offer. And I've never been prescriptive about what should be included or shouldn't. But Charlotte Perrien was a visionary and a completely brilliant designer, and she's in a league of her own.
And I think what's so interesting about Perrien is that as she became an even more established talent, her appreciation for Asian art, Asian artifacts, sort of working their way into her very modernistic vision, which then itself became almost rustic in a way as she got farther along, so that you have these crisscrossing moments. So, I mean, like Rose, could we see, I think it's slide 11 of
I don't know what that is, so I'm going to be surprised.
See, we're going to check it. Let's just double check if it's slide 11. Yes, it's again, it's these feelings of modern and old and contemporary, and I don't want to use the word timeless, and I never want to use the word curated, with apologies to Justin. But what I like about it is I use the word a lot, and people don't follow it necessarily, is a catholicity of taste, an appreciation for this period, that period, the future, the past, the present, and being able to bring them all together in a way that is not necessarily unique, let's not say that, but idiosyncratic, that it is of that room, of that person, of that house.
Well, I hope so, and good.
If I may jump in, I think that's what the true
Please,
collector is about. You know, you somehow built your own identity in the discovery of objects that you love, and I think in all of your work, Rose, that you choose very specifically certain objects that you have an attachment to it, and in that kind of way, it's writing your own portrait or writing the portrait of the person of your client collector, or and I think that's what's actually very much part of this time we're living in. I somehow feel we also this end of a millennial has taken on for a very long time, and sometimes I feel we're somehow still attached to the 20th century, and that's why we kind of revive all these moments, and we're not so futuristic. And in our work, it's a lot to do also about learning from the past. You learn from the masters of the past.
Yeah.
And that's what you said also was about making it ready for today's world. Like the beautiful house you live in it in such a casual and wonderful way that has nothing to do with the purpose it was built for.
Well, thank you. I think I always want to respond to architecture. I think you're the same, Boris.
Yes. I'm in a coffee roasting factory for the moment.
Are you having a cup of coffee?
No, water.
Yeah. But I feel like we should start there, and then we respond. So in this room, which is bonkers, it needed to function as a space that we could live. It needed to have a humanity. It needed to have a calm and a sense of purpose. And it is a study, and I work here, and David works here, and we also have a sitting area here. It's very defined, and it needed to have space in the middle because I often bring tables in to do certain projects, or we might eat here, and every part is defined. And to me, then building the furniture within that, it has to be beautiful and practical, essentially, because otherwise it's a joke. It's not an interior that works.
And again, this idea of these conversations between time periods and art and sculpture and a piece of contemporary furniture. I think one of the slide 17, which is one of yours, Boris's, I love. It's the wassail bowl and the shiraga.
Mm-hmm. That's I think at my parents' home.
That is, to me, such a powerful combination.
I love this
objects. Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing. The authenticity of this art is fantastic. He made his dancing with his feet on the canvas. So there's a spontaneity to that, which is very important.
And then below it, with this beautiful bowl and this very, one could say, sort of muscularly classical architecture around it, is that combination of forms, completely unexpected.
Mm-hmm. These are
I think that's one of the most important parts of connoisseurship, is to be able to bring together, through the idea of cross-collecting, these incredibly strong objects that on their own are amazing, but together they become something more.
I don't think they become more. I think you reimagine it differently.
That's what I think. Absolutely. They elevate each other.
I've lost my screen, but
I know one of the things when I saw Boris's that particular slide of that magnificent Shiraga painting in the wassail bowl, it reminded me very much of slide 2. I was sort of looking for objects wherein two completely disparate forms came together, and I'm sorry, it must be slide 3 then.
Yeah, with the Brancusi.
Yes, with the Brancusi and the 17th century Italian base at Mouton. I mean, two things that were never meant to be together, but are together, and they enhance one another.
Exactly.
The antique becomes modern, and the Brancusi becomes rooted in history. It's quite an astonishing combination of material and form.
And the Giacometti at the end of the corridor.
Exactly.
They did well at buying those things at the right moment.
They did very well. But I mean, but I think the same thing. I think the same thing at your parents' house. The combinations of objects just stun me.
In that last slide as well, the colors, the one before, Boris, your slide, the colors are so incredible because everything is elevated.
Slide 17.
The one we lost.
But here too, yeah.
The painting has the door and the concert table. It has everything within it, and the wall.
And the ecological part of recuperating here also links to the fact that when we work in a house, we always tend to use lime washers mixed with the earth of the location, and so this is the sand from where the house is standing.
Mm.
So the color is not from Siena; it's the color from just outside the door.
I love that.
But then it was a bit too rustic, so our painter added some marbling on it with the topsoil, and so it really creates a marble from the earth of the location.
I mean, what I'm hearing a lot, which I think is quite magnificent as a lesson, is, you know, the idea of these objects, of falling in love with these disparate time periods and disparate artists, is another part of being a connoisseur, is learning how to combine them, learning how to pull something else out of them that one didn't maybe not had noticed before.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also about, and I think that's what we learned today, is that we are globally connected and globally inspired through so many different time zones. And on the other hand, we live at the moment from our root, from home, from being where we are.
I mean, Justin, would you like to chime in on this?
Sorry, I'm on mute.
All right.
I think you think we're rather old-fashioned, Justin.
No, not at all. I'm trying to. It's a position I've been thinking about for a while. This idea that somehow we've stopped challenging ourselves when it comes to living differently, and that we've reached this kind of comfortable but also uncomfortable impasse with the interior, especially obviously at the. I suppose the thing about modernism is that it allowed the greatest architects and designers to think about homes for a different stratum of society. But what's interesting is that having started off talking about this very visionary position that Perriand and Corbu took, you were right, Mitch, to say that later her work becomes rustic. And in fact, in the 1930s, or from the late 1930s onwards, she really abandons the machine aesthetic and metal in particular, because it starts to become associated with militarization and fascism. And suddenly she's choosing these objects that she finds in nature, like tree trunks and stones, and her tables start to become irregular and organic. And now, I mean, it only took 10 years for her to jump to a position that you are all articulating very clearly today, which is this idea of the found object, the relationship between things, you know, ancient forms like stones coexisting with modern forms, wicker chairs with bent metal bookcases. Actually, it would be helpful to look at slide number 7, if you have it, because this is a very different kind of room. It's actually a student dormitory for the Maison de la Tunisie at the Cité Universitaire in Paris, basically a university dorm room. And it's very modest, as student rooms are, but on the right-hand side there, you see that famous bookcase. And I mean, at least in one of its incarnations, which she created with Jean Prouvé and Galerie Steph Simon and so on. And it was a very modest, modular, intended to be mass-produced thing. Now, if you tried to buy that, it would be hundreds of thousands of pounds. And it's just interesting how particular epochs or particular eras in design assume that cachet of the visionary and the expensive. But it's interesting that something from a student dorm could become so coveted. But it is.
Well, it's beautifully designed, isn't it? It's superbly practical, does everything it needs to do. Everything's there, and it's clever. It feels human. Scale is excellent.
And it's from 1952, but it's utterly contemporary today.
Yeah.
And when I saw that piece in your slide presentation before we all met today, the first thing that popped into my head was I remember the colors on that. And I remember thinking instantly, if I owned that, I would put one of Giles Grandy's Infantado chairs with it. Those great lacquered 18th century Portuguese, for a Spanish nobleman. I suddenly felt like I needed to leap across centuries to introduce them.
Well, you're going over my head now, Mitch, so I'll let one of the expert collectors chime in.
I probably think that's horrifying.
But how do you see the future of modernism in the home of tomorrow, Justin?
Well, that is in a way my question, because I think that the way it's being presented to us today is through home technologies like the smart home, through devices like voice-activated assistants and so on. This idea that this modernist idea that technology will deliver us from drudgery and labor persists today in smart home technologies. And also in this idea that we can continue to make space efficiencies in flats to make them smaller and smaller. We've taken out all the corridors. Even in your gracious room there, Rose, you said clearly that multiple functions happen in the same room, and that is the definition of contemporary living. There was this great diagram of, I guess from the 1920s or 30s, when someone did a map of how many meters a housewife would cross through corridors, and they kind of in their lifetime, and they drew a kind of line from Paris all the way to Siberia, and that was and that somehow by creating the spatial efficiency you're talking about, you've just eliminated that journey for someone. And I think we're still kind of there. We haven't come up with anything particularly different since then.
We can just walk round and around this room.
But I mean, I think it's, Boris, you asked me the question and I'll return it. I mean, how do you see it? Because you and your father do have this very particular worldview, and it is, not to joke, Mitch, but it is curated, and your father has curated very, venerable art exhibitions in Venice and so on. How do you see us evolving this idea of the interior?
We're quite busy with that, because my brother doesn't work in the gallery, but he's busy with real estate development, and there we're trying to make a very high quality housing that are small, small to compare to our work as interior designers, but to build in a very sustainable way. And we're specialists in repurposing iconic architecture for the world of tomorrow. And so I do feel that there is a lesson to be learned from keeping beautiful architecture from the past and allowing it to get a new life. And we love to do projects like that, and to make them sustainable for at least the next 50 or 100 years.
But that makes complete sense. Sustainability is clearly essential. We're in a different conversation from the collecting one, I guess.
Exactly.
But what's interesting though is Boris is talking about bringing iconic architecture, keeping it alive, bringing it forward. And I think as long as you're going to be bringing that forward, you need to fill it with beautiful things of the past and the present. And I think maybe could that very well be what our modern trajectory is that we're just simply moving into the past and bringing the most, we're moving into the future and bringing the most beautiful objects of the past with us to join us in that future.
I think when I opened the shop 10 years ago now, or more, 11 years ago, the point of it actually was just to show antique furniture in a very minimal contemporary way. And it was simply because my experience of antique shops, certainly in the early, when I was young, they were daunting, and I just thought it would be. There are so many beautiful things out there, and it's just lovely to. It was nice for me to feel that we could show it with some air, with some space, with some breathing space, and I feel that I think there's so much still to explore. And we're okay, Boris. You collect antiquities as well, don't you?
We do, yes.
We
really start connecting
beautiful objects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but you also do it in a responsible way today, with respect for what's happening in the world, making sure the provenance is perfect, that it hasn't been looted within the recent history. I mean, you need to bring expertise to that, and also social consciousness, and I think that's also very relevant today, that you can live in a world of tomorrow, inspired by the future, but responsibly.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also we see so many contemporary shapes in early pieces. It's always a pleasure to see how things can work.
And we see also so many modern works that are taking their silhouette from 200 years ago, 300 years ago, and just reinterpreting them in a new material. And I think that's fascinating, is this constancy.
Yeah.
And that's something that you need to learn. I think that's where I think it's important that we keep to do our job, to teach the younger generations that there's so many links in history, and that you wouldn't have had 18th century English furniture without Ming furniture, and how it influenced each other, and like all these cross-cultural. I personally, I don't like so much the cross-collecting. I think it's really about bringing links to that are alive in the world. And you need to understand this from a cultural dimension than from the just owning it.
Cross collecting is I hadn't heard the expression until I was asked to do this. I mean,
yes,
that's not.
It's a very masterpiece word, I think.
Right, it's not collecting in a niche way. We're not collecting, stamps from the 1810s.
No, it's sort of the idea of the collector being broad-minded. Of saying, just because I like Chippendale chairs doesn't mean I'm not going to like a Chiraga painting, and then because I think that's the thing that the word collecting frightens people. It sounds so specific and narrow, where actually the joy of it is it's so broad, it's so wide.
Yeah.
There's so much beauty for all of us to gather together. And Boris saying Ming, which made me instantly think of Charlotte Perriand and her sort of explorations of Asian design, and bringing that into her work. But yet it was still a modern statement, but it resonated with a 200-year-old, 300-year-old echo.
But if I find a kitchen table from Central France in walnut, some of them are 200 years old, and they're made in a very similar way than the Perriand tables. They're all pegged and beautiful elm, and today you can still find them for a fraction of the price of what's the reincarnation of that is.
It's about it's the quality of it, isn't it?
It's the quality, it's the authenticity. It's the spirit of the piece.
Yeah, the feel, the patina, the age, everything.
And I think what was really wonderful, I loved reading, did you all read Philip's article in Apollo about being at home and looking at his collections? And I thought that was a really, really beautiful way to think of being at home and looking at what you own and moving it around and seeing what goes better with what. And why don't we try this juxtaposition? Or what am I missing? I thought I had all of this and now I have a gap.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, it makes you realize how plastic collecting is, how just, it's just a shape-shifting exploration of things we find beautiful.
But I think the combinations are so vital, because something wants to be, an object or a piece of furniture needs to feel at home, doesn't it? It needs to feel absolutely at home.
Can we see slide, I think it's slide 19, and Boris, I believe it's one of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was a combination of objects that
that's another room at the castle.
That everything felt so right.
And yet it's so many different worlds. From the paintings are Korean and Japanese, the sculpture is Thai, and the two lions are Japanese, and the little primitive chair is probably alpine, made by a shepherd. You know, it's like,
I think Charlotte Perriand would have loved this room.
Would have loved it. Should have sat in that armchair. But everything feels at home there. Everything feels right.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly beautiful.
Yeah, it's the room where my father decided to be the most kind of brutal with the house, because it was this room was part of the hall below it, where you saw the other slide in the 17th century, and then in the 19th century they made it in a separate room, and moved the staircase that was there to its own space, and then plastered the ceilings, etc. And a lot of those relics were taken out of the house to show back the 17th century beams, put the Belection molding fireplace in, but then keep the door and the casing from the 19th century house.
And I imagine that because the light, it looks like the light is falling perfectly on the chair, so you can read well. Yeah,
the house is built exactly on the north-south axis, and so on the right-hand side is south, so the light beams in. It's fantastic. I think there's another slide with the light, with the view out, actually.
Yes, that would be slide 18, I believe.
Yeah.
No,
yes.
I haven't seen that picture before. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So the room was actually created around the Tapier's painting. When Axel bought that in the 80s, when we were moving to the castle, then it didn't really fit the house, so that's why the ceiling had to come out, and the balcony had to come off to get it inside.
Whole house was rebuilt. Fantastic. But I did.
And also,
it's often that happens, right? You have a piece of something that needs to go somewhere, and it's going to hold the whole room.
Everything changed, and that's why this room was first painted also with the soil of the sand of the house of here, and in that sense very much trying to connect to nature, and the plain pine flooring was put there in the end of the 18th century or early 19th, and we just washed it.
One of the things that I know this is an important part of our discussion are the questions, of which we have many coming in, and I hope you're all ready. I think what was really interesting is a question from Nick, and I will not attempt to pronounce your surname because I will get it violently wrong. But I think that the advice you would give to young collectors embarking on their journey into the world of antiques and decorating, and how can one find their own voice without copying other people? Who would like to jump in on either one of those questions?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
I think that looking around is essential. Look at everything. Visit buildings, go to shops, look at furniture, go to museums, go to the Vinay, the Heraclean Museum in Crete. You start to see, the more you see, the more you can slot things into their place. You understand things in relation to other things, what's good, what's not so good.
And ask
very long journey.
And ask questions. I think young people have the openness to be able to ask a lot of questions, and will get all the response they want or need from and sometimes older generation of dealers or designers, or because they're blessed with that being young and being curious.
And I don't think
dealers love to talk and share their knowledge.
Yes, so you need to ask them questions. You need to ask them enthusiastic questions, and then you will learn so much.
But also diving in the deep end isn't necessary through buying from shop. I mean, I think I started my buying career trying to furnish a house very cheaply, going to marble yards and asking for offcuts and making tables with bases I could find. And it was just all about spatial planning and what would work, what colors would work. But I didn't have much money to do anything very, very swank. But it was, I could create something, you can create something beautiful without much money easily.
Aliza has a question that I think echoes very much both Rose, your aesthetic, and Boris is as well. And she says, it appears to me that tone and form present some of the primary linkages across eras. Is that accurate? I think when we look at your rooms across eras, we're seeing materials and forms and tones automatically coming together, being coupled.
But they can, should we look at, I can't read the slide with the albers. The 10, number 10. It isn't really that there's, these two pictures are the same ante-room. So the Stingle, the gold painting on the left, is opposite the albums. And actually, I felt that these spaces were rooted with the chairs, the mahogany chair on the left. That's actually there because it gets used around the kitchen table and it needs to be housed, but somehow it rooted everything. I don't know that it's tonally, I mean, you can see that there's a feel, to my mind, that works. And again, with the little chair that kind of grounds the Albus and the satellite on the rectangle image. It's just, it makes it a little bit more humble to me. It's not so much a tonal feel, it just, I wanted a humility, and particularly in this house, because it's so, the architecture is so grand. I didn't want to exploit that.
But yet the artwork has its own presence and importance. It's not over decorated. It just makes it more human.
Yes, and they're strong, aren't they? They hold
yes.
the space.
And the Albers, of course, also show very much that kind of inspired view of modernism. Traveling with his wife to Mexico and photographing Mitla, and these are exact images of the temple.
Exactly.
He paints in abstract painting. So.
And then you see the link of the colors through, and.
Yes. Suddenly it's like textile. It's like it's so.
But what's interesting though is sort of the flip to that answer would be if the idea of exploring a great many styles and cultures for inspiration, perhaps tone and form will help you bring them together a little more easily, sort of almost like as a 1.0 version of collecting across a broader viewpoint.
Yes, I guess it's difficult to pinpoint that, because I feel for me it depends what you're trying to achieve. If it's a
Mhm.
little, if it's a humility, if it's a playfulness, if it's a little bit of seriousness, if it's something, well, the satellite here on the right-hand side lends a playfulness. It's slightly off. It's not in, it's not
Mhm.
center. It just has, it's just.
Yes, Rose, but that's a way of reading it. If you see the social message of Stingel and the social message of Albers and how it relates to each other, I think it's also a very meaningful dialogue that's happening there. And you can read it through form and color, but you can also read it in many more ways.
Mhm.
And I think that's interesting. That for me, that's quite interesting, and that's why I think it's good to study art history and to learn from the past
Absolutely. The more you see, the more you understand, and the more you can interpret, as you say, in any way you want. It can be, it's fairly fluid.
Here's a question for Justin. Justin has reminded me to reflect on Mies and the Barcelona pavilion and how incredible it was to be taking walls away, rendering them in new materials, designing furniture exclusively for those spaces, and giving people a vision, a new vision on how to inhabit a space. But I think this was intended for a broader audience than we're able to reach or achieve today. I'm wondering if the questioner is wondering, because the Barcelona pavilion was incredibly high end, but yet they were speaking to a broader world.
I think this is the great paradox of, you know, so much modernist design. And it was if we're talking about the disparity between the aims of the designers and the audiences that they ultimately reached, this is the great paradox of so much modernism. And it was the paradox that William Morris faced when he tried to make, you know, when he speech after speech about socialism, but making chairs that not, you know, that only the upper middle class could afford. And I think that you know, it is one thing to aspire to an ideal through design, a spatial design, but it is another thing to make it accessible. And those spaces and the furniture that was designed for those spaces, Perignon no exception, you know, is unfortunately elitist, and there's nothing that, you know, there was very little getting around that until, you know, you get to companies like IKEA.
But that can be great. I think if we're talking about the younger generation, and why not having good design that's made in a sustainable way and live with it, and then maybe save for a more unique kind of maybe a little painting or a sculpture, or it can start a dialogue, it can start a way of living.
George's question is, what is your starting process when you first look at a room?
To me, that's the bones of the architecture. It's
Okay.
to find the architectural key of the volume, and hopefully it's a classically built building with respect of sacred geometry, and often these ancient or older buildings have been kind of separated, and suddenly when you discover the key, you understand that some walls need to go, and then you start to get the historic analysis, and that then confirms that that's the right take on the building.
Mm.
I feel I'm the same. Start with the architecture. Where has it been? What needs to happen? Do we need to reintroduce something that's been lost, or do we need to? And we were going to combine that with the needs of anyone living in a space. What do we want? How do we make something actually work? And different rooms must have different functions, otherwise you'll never use them. And what is it? And then the combination of all of that.
Exactly, and I think even 18th century house has a kitchen in the basement.
Yeah.
But a modern family will not live in their basement when they have a beautiful formal rooms upstairs,
Yeah.
which they'll never use. So you need to reverse it, and I think that's also a contemporary way to make buildings ready for the future, because we need to adapt them to our lifestyle.
Absolutely.
Another question, millennials are tending less towards being tied down with property and home ownership. How do you think this will change and impact the art of collecting if people are no longer investing in building a collection? I wouldn't want to be one of those people, frankly.
Well, I'm not sure that.
I like things too much.
Yeah, you don't have to own your own home to be interested in starting a small collection.
Actually, I know a few people that have this kind of global life, and they move constantly, and they go from rental home to rental home, but they always travel with their art.
Yeah.
They travel with their favorite pieces, like they travel with their clothes.
I mean, that's the way to root yourself in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we collect over time, at different times of our lives, things have memory, etc.
And it might even be more interesting to collect that way, because then you don't collect because you have the wall for it. You collect because you really can't live without it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that brings me to another question. Another listener had mentioned, what did you begin collecting when you were just starting out? And how has your collecting focus changed over time?
Shall I go first, Boris, or do you want to?
Sure.
I think I actually did start collecting because I had a home and to put things in, and I needed to. Well, I had a home that was empty, so I started to buy. In fact, I started buying old curtains, so antique textiles, and used them within this house that I had. I had young children, and I had needed quite a lot of space. Everything was from reclamation yards, vintage shops. It was really exciting. It made the whole, and I'm a restorer. I started life as a restorer. So furniture and how to access furniture, if you like, seeing it, it wasn't foreign to me. And so just searching around, I mean, I really bought things just for practical reasons. As I say, a bit of marble with a base, and we had a whole table which stayed with me for 15 years. That's how it was for me.
I join you on the marble and the stones, because as a kid I started a collection of pebble from stones, from pebbles to semi-precious stones to crystals to I would travel home from a beach and bring a nice pebble, and
Nice.
I still live with this collection, and we go on, and now my husband and I are actually continuing the collection, and it's been like 40 years in the making. And in our bedroom we have a terrace, and on the terrace I put shelves, and this is where all these rocks live.
That's lovely.
So they're this little piece of the world that are next to me.
Justin, what do you collect?
Well, I don't, apart from books. But the last time I considered myself a collector, I was probably 13, and I was collecting little tintype photographs in American flea markets. So basically little daguerreotypes of Civil War fighters or families. And actually, I really must dig them out and look at them again. Very strange things.
Yes, how could you show them? That's a challenge.
Yeah, I'm assuming they haven't faded since I bought them, because they've been sitting in a little box, but
they're daguerreotype.
Daguerreotypes, yeah.
So then you need to make sure that they stay sealed, otherwise they'll be quite black by now.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the
The
problem.
question was, what was the last thing either of any of you purchased as a collectible object, or art, furniture, anything at all?
I've got something here because it's show and tell, I think.
Beautiful.
What is that, Rose?
An Egyptian bowl. So
Early dynastic, I think.
3000 BC.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful, and you can feel the work in it. It's lovely to hold. It just balances perfectly. and you can feel the work inside. I really, really love it. It gives me pleasure every day.
And they were cut with such primitive tools. It's amazing that they could build such architectural
Imagine how
forms with such. They were actually, the tools are said to be primitive, because, but then in the other hand, it's so difficult to imagine that. I mean, this is before that they built the pyramids.
imagine how long it would have taken to
Hollow that out.
Yes, but then how can you call a culture limited if they could build that, if they could build the Saqqara temple, which is around the same time as this vessel, or a bit later the Cheops. So it's quite, we know so little about where we come from.
I feel like a fool. Show and tell.
Yes.
May I put my object back in my satchel?
Yes, you may. A question for Boris. How does your personal aesthetic differ from your father's?
It's very
challenge.
It's a challenging question, because it's not about, in essence, our vision about it is the same. So we start from the intrinsic quality of an object and the intrinsic quality of architecture, and we bring these worlds together, and the intrinsic quality of course, what I added to that is that I started to be very much interested in the artists of my generation, and started the representation of that, and added to being an antique dealer, also to be a gallery. And that's something which I brought this more contemporary aspect into the business side of it, where my father was mostly a collector of contemporary. And but we really don't, of course there is an aesthetic, but we really don't want it to be about the aesthetic. And so when you will ask him to work on a project, it's going to be different than if I would do it. We typically don't work together on a project, because I feel there is always different ways to go to get there, and it makes no sense to argue about how to get there.
A question for Rose. How has your mother's distinct aesthetic honed as a dealer affected your own?
Oh, she influenced me hugely. I mean, I think she's got excellent taste, and I mean, I grew up in her houses, and they were always what was so good about them. They were very, very comfortable and very elegant, and nothing too extravagant. It wasn't like that at all. But you always felt welcome in her houses and her spaces. And I think I was huge. She also worked with a very clearly quite progressive architect, I think, in Oxford at the time. And they built a room in the 70s as an extension to the Arms house that we lived in, which was obviously old. Mm-hmm. And it was a big influence on me, although I didn't realize it at the time at all, of course, as you're a child. But the way the old house ran very comfortably into this new extension, which was beautifully done with glass all around and the sunken, very 70s shag pile carpet that ran up the. So, and it was very, very spare. 2 grand pianos at one end, because my mom and I both played the piano, and then sunken seating, leather. I mean, it was beautiful, and she did a superb job, and I've been hugely influenced.
Sure. Axel's mother, my grandmother, also influenced both of us very much in that kind of way. She built her house right before the war, and after the war she completely made it very bare with white chalked walls, terracotta flooring. She had a very modern take on the housing with objects of the past. She loved to restore 17th century buildings in downtown Antwerp, and live with help the artists that were living in the city at that moment. So all of what we've been doing for the last 50, 60 years has really
Is your
rooted in-
grandmother's taste?
It's my grandmother's, is an evolution out of my grandmother's vision.
I would like to thank you all so much for joining me and Masterpiece Online, Boris Vervoordt, Rose Heyman, Justin McGuirk. Thank you all for talking about design, collecting, your passions, and the world we love.